Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. So welcome to the Stoa. Let's do some check-ins. I'm feeling sort of a lightness, a little sad. And vulnerable. So the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And I'm Peter Lindbergh, the Steward. And today we are lucky to have my favorite trickster, Alexander Bard. And before we begin, I wanted to apologize to Bard. Let's just say that I wasn't the best friend to him, and he knows why. So I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And that being said, I'll hand it over to Raven.
All right, and hi everyone, I'm Raven. I'm going to be hosting the Q&A today. So I'll just describe what we're going to be doing. So we're going to have Bard talking for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we'll move into Q&A. We'll warm it up with some questions from Peter and I, and then we'll open up to Q&A from the audience. You can put your questions in the chat and I will call your name. And you can ask your question to Bard. And with that, to the trickster himself, Alexander. Unmute yourself, sir.
Okay.
There we go.
It's wonderful to be here. And thank you so much, Peter and Raven, for having me. And Peter, whatever that concerned, your apology is completely accepted. And hey, I'm not the easiest guy in the world to deal with. And you grow every day in everything you do. So total deep, big brotherly love in your direction right away. And don't worry about a thing. And Raven, so nice to have you here. By the way, this is Queen Raven, so I'm just her slave. So she will decide whatever she wants this evening. Yeah, I'll leave everything. The control button is hers. So I'll just take a few minutes to do the presentation, and then we can move to the questions and answers that I very much look forward to. So when I discussed this thing about the Stoa and how I could possibly participate with Peter last week, we came to the conclusion that it could be a good time to sort of touch base on where we're at, because obviously a major event is going on in the world. And the way you know that a major event is going on in the world is the fact that you have to tell exactly which date you're talking. This happens to be April 24. 2020. And because things are changing at just a rapid pace, it's impossible to talk about what's going on in the world right now without actually referring to the date. And I can't think of anything more evident when it comes to defining an event than this. Now, the weird thing is that this all sort of relates to a pandemic that we call the corona pandemic. I prefer to call it the grand corona right now, because it's way more than a pandemic. Pandemics aren't rare. We usually have, say, about 7 or 8 major global pandemics like this every century or so. It's just that we've been lucky. We haven't had a major pandemic like this that we know of, at least. And well, the last time was the Hong Kong flu, which is called in the late 1960s, before the Asian flu in the late 1950s. It's possible the corona is going to get even worse than those two, but they were pretty bad. The Asian flu in 1957-58 killed about 5 million people in the world, and we had about half the population that we do now, or even less. So it would take the corona to kill 10 million people to get there. It's not unlikely that would happen. It's very likely, actually, the corona has killed far more people than statistics allows right now. We have major bad situations in many parts of the world right now, even in countries that declared only 40 or 50 people dead. We have, rebellion already happening. So this is a bad situation. But the pandemic itself is not that unique. What is unique is that this is the first major pandemic in the internet age. And that makes it different. I often say that we probably by early March, which is more than a month ago, the pandemic was no longer the major problem to the world, but actually the hysteria surrounding the pandemic has become much more of a problem since then. And I would say this, not lightheartedly, without making myself much of a Rousseauian victim, hating those things. I've suffered a really bad bout of COVID-19 myself, and I was really sick for a couple of weeks, and I also got it back again, which warned me that this is not something you easily get over. It's not a regular flu at all. And I've lost a couple of friends already. And I know a lot of men my age, I'm in my mid-50s, that have gone really sick from this virus. So it's not something you play around with lightly at all. And I'm glad my father died a respectful death last year, 87 years old, because he's one of those men out there who wouldn't stand a chance if he'd been hit by the COVID-19. I would know, because I had it myself. But having said that, even more so, having said that, with the credibility that comes with actually having suffered from the virus and had a bad bout of it, I would say that we are now way past the point where the pandemic is the problem. Rather, it's the hysteria. Now, that's, of course, also interesting, not only in a cynical way. There's also creative opportunity coming out of creative destruction. That means that if you learn from history, if you learn from previous pandemics, we know that even the worst pandemics ever, even like the plague in the 14th century, came with certain benefits. I would even say that the plague in the 6th century was even worse because it killed my favorite religion, Zoroastrianism, and replaced it with a religion that I detest called Islam. So personally, I would say that the plague in the 6th century was the really bad one. The plague in the 14th century was better in many ways. It actually created the opportunity for the Renaissance and eventually, of course, the Enlightenment and the Reformations in Europe. So we don't know where this is going to end up. It's probably not going to be on that type of scale at all. But I would definitely say this is a major event seen over the last 30, 40 years. It's a global event. And as I said, this is the first major pandemic of the internet age. So in what way is this different? Well, we're all connected. We have a population of about 8 billion people on this planet. And actually, the majority of people on the planet today are connected through the internet, through their smartphones and laptops and other gadgets. And increasingly also, more and more intelligent machines around us are getting connected. Some people even force their pets to go online these days, apparently even with COVID-19 tests. But there's far more people connected than ever before in history, and we are directly connected one another. Now, I've written books about this. I worked on this for the past 30 years. It's actually the reason why I wanted to become a philosopher in the first place, because I thought the internet is such a dramatic revolution that it has to be covered by philosophy. It is a phenomenon that even my favorite philosophers like Hegel and Nietzsche could never even have thought about. They couldn't even comprehend it, only 100 or 150 years ago, that this phenomenon would occur in history. So the internet itself is one of the biggest events ever. This means that the old power structure that we built basically on the printing press, and the fact that we made people around the world, we gave them the capacity to read and write and count, and following later, 200-300 years after printing press was invented, it became affordable for people around the world to read, write, and count. And they did on a massive scale. And this, of course, created a paradigm that was basically dominated by what we call the West, which is Europe and eventually the 3 other continents that Europeans colonized and plundered to take over the world. That's the world we lived in. Then starting in the 1980s, the internet came along. And we could already then start thinking of the world differently, because we'd actually, what we tend to forget about, we'd actually gone through another technological revolution just before the internet arrived that made it easier for us to comprehend it. And that was flying. We had the mythology of Icarus, and Icarus trying to reach the sun and getting killed in the process because it was hubristic to think that you could ever fly like a bird. And although we tried in so many ways, at the end of the 19th century, we managed to figure out how we could build machines with which we could take the human body up into the sky. So we started flying. We started flying more and more. And we started using, flights or planes during warfare, and discovered there were also great weapons. And eventually we put a bomb inside one of those flights and put that flight over a little town called Hiroshima in Japan on August 6th, 1945, and dropped a bomb on it. And I still, as a philosopher, think that that major event, again, an event that changes history forever, that major event is still something we're dealing with. We have hardly even started to understand what it means that we as human beings have created a technology which could wipe us out in hardly any time at all. Of course, that led to the Cold War. It also led to the breakdown of phallic authority, of the idea that men out there who are engineers or whatever they are could build a better world for tomorrow. It led us into a real awakening that was both needed and understandable, that we call postmodernism today. And it was the question of, could there be any phallic authority, or could we replace it with something else? And that's the kind of work philosophers like I work with, like what kind of narrative actually makes sense to human beings, and how are we as human beings connected to one another? So this leads us on to the 1980s. Postmodernism had already become the dominant mode, at least in the West. Post-colonial studies were taken on, meaning that the rest of the world was starting to respond to the fact that the West had conquered 3 other continents, plundered them, and, you know, Hitler wasn't the bad guy here. He basically just mimicked what Europeans did in North America about 50 years before him. So this had already happened on a massive scale. And we were starting to realize that we were increasingly living in a globalized world, that just saying apologies to other cultures that you plundered and raped could be a fairly good idea, at least as a start, because we're living in increasingly globalized world. But then the internet came along and connected all of us directly. You could already see in the late 1980s that all the computers that we were already using and now become personal computers, affordable personal computers for the vast majority of people, were now connected directly to one another. So by the late 1980s, you could figure out that, okay, so all the computers are directly connected to one another, meaning they're turning into one huge computer. And this one huge computer is now connecting everybody on the planet. And eventually you could figure out that my hard drive is not going to be the only place where data is being stored from all this communication that goes on, but rather we're going to build huge data centers eventually. And these data centers are going to be incredibly powerful. And we're probably going to call them tech giants in, say, 20 or 30 years' time. That's exactly the sort of society we arrived at. And philosophers figured that out already 30 years ago, and we're now seeing this pattern. But I want to tie the pattern into the idea that at the same time, as we created the atomic bomb and it scared the shit out of us, we also sent the satellites up into the sky. I would say, if we're really honest about it, and the way we have to look at history in hindsight is that after the atomic bomb, we made another big mistake. We went to the moon. We don't like to think of it that way. It's one of those things that I like to question as a trickster. But when we went to the moon in the late 1960s and put a few guys on the moon who jumped around in there on the moon and put a flag there, it turned out to be the American flag, because the Russians were smart enough not to waste hundreds of billions of dollars in getting there. But the Americans did. And if we look back at it now in the moon landing, we didn't go back, did we? No. We left a flag there. Yeah. On what? A cold rock full of radiation. There wasn't any point in going there. And if you're going to look at the whole sort of retelling of the narrative of the past 400 years and start to appreciate what was great with, for example, the European conquest of half the planet and what was bad with it, we also have to look at the difference between the last territorial conquest, successful conquest, in a cynical way, but successful conquest, that both occurred in the late 1950s. And ironically, it was the 2 countries that we call the superpowers today. I would say that probably the 2 worst countries in the world right now, because one of them created the coronavirus and the other one created the corona hysteria. They're called China and the United States. And at the end of the 1950s, China conquered Tibet. And if you're a Buddhist and you like to think that the Tibetan people would have been better off without the Chinese, we're not sure about that, but the China conquered Tibet. But at the same time, the United States conquered Hawaii after Americans had killed probably about 90% of the original Aboriginal population of Hawaii and decimated into nothing. And then a bunch of American senior citizens, the ones who tried to avoid corona at the moment, decided to settle there and make it the most expensive and beautiful place on the planet. That's called Hawaii. But Hawaii was conquered literally by the United States, included as a state in the United States, same time as Tibet was included as a state in China. I found that very interesting because that was also the end of territorial expansion. there's no opportunity for any more territorial expansion after the conquest of Tibet and Hawaii. And the funny thing is that 10 years later, we sent a man to the moon and we declared that a victory. What we're not seeing is that putting people on the moon and wasting hundreds of billions of dollars in doing it, we delayed the movement of hundreds of millions of Indians and Chinese into the middle classes that happened only 30, 40 years later with no help from America or Europe, because we spent so much money in the 1960s on putting a guy on the moon and declaring that a victory, which is nothing but symbolic and no value at all. I think that's a very important lesson to learn, so that we can go back to the late 1950s and then ask ourselves, so what was the point of going into outer space in the first place? Well, there was something fantastic about it. It's called satellites. And if we think of something that ties airplanes, whether they're full of bombs or people, that we travel with today, because with the flights, at least the flights we had before the corona, we could travel from one point on the planet to the opposite point of the planet in less than 24 hours. That is amazing. And with digital, we can literally travel in 0.1 second. So we can play computer games between Finland and New Zealand. Isn't that wonderful, right? So we have arrived in a world which I would call aerodigital or spatial digital, in the sense that we now have satellites that cover the entire planet. And these satellites do two things for us. They both look at us. We was called something called the phallic gaze. This is like the idea is that the goddess is earth, and then the God is up in the sky, and the God looks down on us. Like it's a fatherly phallic gaze that looks down on us on the planet. And of course, if you just use Google Maps, you figure out that's exactly what's happening right now, because we're increasingly getting satellites that get more and more powerful, and they look over the entire planet, and they can look down on anything that happens on the planet and zoom in on it. And with that comes data. We can now educate ourselves by looking anywhere on the planet and then zoom in on a place on the planet and learn about the people who live there, learn their language, learn their culture, learn everything about them and interact with them, which is amazing. The power of this is just fantastic. Now, it should also scare the shit out of us, because the two different versions of understanding this idea of a satellited world. And one of them is that, yeah, we got a lot of problems as humanity. We need to lock up the bombs somewhere. After this pandemic, we've also discovered that what could be even worse than a pandemic would be biological weapons. So we need to figure out how we lock those up and protect ourselves from them. We're going to have chemical weapons more than ever. Okay, we need to lock up the weapons. Okay. We also have a planet that we more or less destroyed, starting exactly with the conquest of the planet and of all these different territories and, this massive expansion territorial that we did. And we built mines everywhere, and we started plundering it. And then we started using oil and gas and coal to burn this whole thing to get cheap electricity. And we were almost at the point where we realized, okay, this is going to kill us if we don't stop this as well. This will also increase the demand for a different world order. The problem is that the new world order that's needed and that can be made possible now when we can get data from anywhere on the planet and boom that data into the satellites, and the satellites then reflect back on us and communicate with us in an intelligent way, and we start building artificial intelligence into this to boost it even further. We will create a sensocracy here. We'll create a world where we have sensors absolutely everywhere, in the atmosphere, in the waters of the seas, on our bodies. And I would even say that it's likely that the number of sensors will increase in density the more people you have around. So this is, of course, what the Internet of Things is all about today, but we're increasingly seeing that these sensors are going to be everywhere, and we're going to interact with technologies and with machines just about everywhere we go. So it's a whole new man versus machine relationship that's maturing here. It's connected to the satellites. It's connected to information data flows. Okay. It doesn't take too long for somebody to start fantasizing about, what if I'm the guy at the top of this whole thing? It turns out that the probably most powerful person on the planet, who also happens to rule the country where the coronavirus started, is called Xi Jinping. And he has that fantasy. The problem with that fantasy is that it's been tried before. It hasn't been a very good fantasy. It is a fantasy that starts either as a Peter Pan syndrome or as a Caligula syndrome. That means that it's even an 11-year-old who was appointed to be the emperor way too early in his life and before he was mature enough to take on that role. Or he was somebody who was probably pretty sane, but grew up in an environment that was so damn crazy that he came across as a totally paranoid character once he was given power because he couldn't trust anybody. Imagine you can have all the power in the world, you're the king of the world, but you can't trust anybody. It's called Caligula syndrome. It's the opposite of Peter Pan syndrome, but in any case, it's disastrous because we all know that only a guy who grows up in a healthy, nice environment and becomes, you know, and learns that as a girl, he can become a woman and he can become a matriarch, or she can become a boy, he can become a man, can become a patriarch eventually. Unless we go through these archetypal sort of steps in our lives so we can take on parenting, we can take on teaching, we can take on eventually maybe even be elderly of a community because we're wise and older, we've been around a long time. Unless all these processes work and we appoint 11-year-olds to run the world, or people who mentally are 11-year-olds, we get a problem. And the problem starts with Akhenaten in Egypt about 1300 before Christ, when Egypt goes into a really brutal, ruthless dictatorship. And it was only after Akhenaten died and his son Tutankhamun took over that the priests of Egypt decided to kill the son to get the whole shit out of the way. That leads us all the way up to the beautiful Silk Route that connected East and West, still the most magnificent construction in human history. But what happened in the 20th century is that the payback from Europe in terms of ideas was that we reversed the Silk Route and repeated Akhenaten all over again. As if we hadn't learned from all these horrible dictators throughout history. We let Hitler be one of them, Mussolini be one of them, we let Stalin be one of them, and eventually the Asians caught on and they got Mao Zedong. And eventually we get to the end of the 1960s and a young Cambodian student at Sorbonne in Paris writes a PhD on Rousseau and goes home to his country, Cambodia, and kills 2 million people, starting with the people who wore glasses. That's the madness of Peter Pan syndrome. And the problem today with the sociocracy, and especially now with the corona pandemic is creating corona hysteria, is that suddenly people are asking themselves, okay, we had the climate hysteria before this. So we want sensors everywhere so we can keep track of climate, so we can know what climate change is going on and where damage is being done. So we can have proper arguments to argue that we don't want any more oil or gas or coal because we need to save the planet so humanity can stay here. And we need machines to help us with that. We need technologies to help us with that. All of that was out there. But the problem is now with the pandemic going into hysterical phase and with 8 billion people sitting with megaphones in their hands and not feeling that they have any parents around to protect them, so they become children of a lesser God, who they shout at the top of their lungs and say, save me from this melee. The first thing you're going to see is that a lot of people are going to say, oh, wait a second. If you can just track your smartphone, and if we know exactly where your body is, we can lock up all the people who are evil people, and then we can make them into scapegoats, and everybody else can be free, and we can save them from the virus. We hear these voices everywhere. We just don't hear them in China. No, the Chinese are used to it because they've heard it from a dictatorship from the Communist Party for the past 40, 50 years. No, we hear this now in East Asia. We hear this now across Europe. We hear this now in the United States. We're increasingly hearing it in countries like Brazil and Mexico, where democracy is pretty young. So what we're hearing now is this voice that, oh, we could use technology to control the things we don't like. That opens up the door for Xi Jinping not being a Chinese phenomenon anymore, but being actually a local phenomenon that could easily become a universal phenomenon in that case. And what I would like to discuss is how we can contain the virus enough to then contain the hysteria, to have a proper discussion on how we can move towards a sensocracy, because I believe in it and I believe it's unavoidable and I believe it has enormous benefits. But if we can live in a world where the satellites look down on us and we have data about just about everything we do in the world, can that still be a world where power is so decentralized that we can guarantee plurality, we can guarantee tolerance, we can guarantee openness? Because I believe all those values and what we learned from the past 4,000 or 5,000 years of history is that any culture that can maintain those things will not be 11 years of hell and havoc, but rather be thousands of years of prosperity. Can we create a truly pluralistic sensocracy? I think that's the answer we owe to tell the world, and we can direct it directly to Xi Jinping hopefully make him resign, but we need an alternative to the current Confucian European fantasy. The dictator is on his way back. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And we already have like amazing questions in the chat. We're gonna start. I'm gonna ask Peter if you would like to share your question.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you, my friend. I have a question that feels related, but might not seem directly related. And it's John Vervaeke. He came to the Stoa a couple of weeks ago, and he said that this bubbling up in him. And he said he wanted to steal the culture. And it's sort of been like a rallying cry at the Stoa, like, let's steal the culture. And Akira the Dawn is even going to make like a little nice tune on that clip of John. And so I'm curious of your thought of if the culture needs to be stolen, how to do it. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
No, I don't think the culture needs to be stolen. I think the culture is emerging. If anything is emerging, where one of John Vervaeke's favorite terms actually makes sense. It isn't this. I give you an example of what I did when I got the COVID-19 and got really sick. Okay, before that, I knew the hysteria would be incredibly problematic. I'm an economist by training, and this is going definitely to be the worst economic crisis the world has seen since 1929. And we all know historically that if we arrive at an unemployment rate of over 25%, we get rebellion. It's already happening now in Europe. We got bad scenes happening in the suburbs of Paris. The lockdown is not working any longer. So a softer approach would probably be better to begin with. But I also knew when I got the COVID-19, I came home and I already asked from a couple of friends who'd been sick like a week or two before me. And I just connected with them and they said, you know what, there are thousands of men of our age out there who are experiencing exactly the same symptoms. We just realized we're not going to die, but we're going to have a really bad bout of the disease and we want to make sure our fathers are not getting close to it. Great. And suddenly it was like I moved into a world with thousands of men who were doing parallel studies of a brand new disease for a brand new virus. Now, then I suddenly saw, yeah, this is the beauty of the internet. This is amazing. That is culture to me. That is the new culture. This is digital culture at its best. It's when people directly find each other and they can also use algorithms to find people around the world who they can communicate with, and they can then instantly create perfectly scientifically viable studies of their own lives. And of course, I got tons of tips from there that I can now use, and my improvement has gotten a lot better. And of course, I felt safe and warm and protected and loved because I was thrown into this tribal community, the subculture of men between 50 and 60 who realized that we're going to have a bad bout of this disease. This is how we survive it and support each other. So the culture is already emerging out there because people are trained to think tribally. I'm totally against individualism. I'm totally against collectivism in my work. I think human beings are deeply tribal. And that's why I love your work, Peter, on nomadic tribes, because it's a great description of what human beings are now discovering about themselves when they're reflecting their own humanity into the digital. Tribal comes back in a big way. And out of this comes culture already. And I wouldn't even dare to speculate what kind of culture that is. But it's spontaneously appearing. It's tribal. It's beyond tribal. It's intertribal. And it's beautiful. So it's already happening.
I have a follow-up question, and this is at the edge of my thinking, so I'm really curious if we can bounce off each other here. My sense is the next move is to try to make mimetic tribes become embodied tribes. I remember Sam Vaknin, he's this narcissist, like a expert in narcissism, who is a narcissist, who got his narcissistic supply from his expertise, right? So it's like so delicious there. And then he said the religion of tomorrow is going to be the religion of narcissism. And of course he's going to say that. And then I thought about it. I'm like, maybe narcissism is like an ecumenical religion, and all these like mimetic tribes, people are narcissistically attached to the ideas and they just want to spit it out. So just pause that for a moment and going back to the kind of stealing the culture line. My sense is that culture in service of ego is not what we need. Like we create these cultural artifacts to just boost up the ego, but culture should be kind of keep ego in check or make it like a healthy relationship with ego. And so, yeah, if anything, for the
Okay, well,
Lockies.
actually, it's all old news because it's called Cartesian individualism. It was invented by a French autist called René Descartes in the 17th century. It's then, for example, become the state religion of North America, especially of the United States. I should avoid mentioning Canada here. And I always say that when I come to America, there's so many things I love about America, but one thing that's really tiresome is that Americans do not understand that they exclusively have a religion called Cartesian individualism that Europeans have at least started dealing with over the last 50 years and the rest of the world never cared about. So the thing is, if you go to the world of physics, it's a great metaphor, is that when something comes at the end of its lifespan, it usually explodes and becomes like a big supernova. And in our book, Digital Libido, Jan Söderqvist and I write explicitly that we must understand that hyper-narcissism, which is happening or has happened, maybe Corona finally killed it, has happened, especially in the 2010s, is at the end of a development starting in the 17th century called Cartesian individualism. And of course, when everybody was told that you live in a world with 8 billion people who are in constant competition with one another and in constant rivalry with one another, and now we give you a tool where you can express yourself called the internet. It was pretty obvious. It would take about 30 years of children's diseases and things like that on the internet, where people mistakenly thought the internet was a way to sell themselves. But I've always told people that already in the early 1990s, you started throwing away newsletters when people only talked about themselves all the time. And they were usually men, and they were over 40 years old. Raven would probably agree with me here. You're tired of the men who are over 40 years old. And it's understandable that everybody else got tired of them because they thought, well, no, finally, I don't need a secretary. I can write my own email. And I'm going to tell everybody what a good boy I am. And I'm going to impress my mom. Right? That's what they always want to do. Impress mom by being this good boy who does amazing things. And always at the end of the email, you would have, this is my new record. This is my new book. You must buy me. Well, the end of that, when even teenage girls got tired, it was called the influencer. And we ended up with the influencer writing their own fan clubs called echo chambers. This was the 2010s. And if anything, that's now dead and over. And this is why I emphasize this enormous difference between a YouTuber and an influencer. Because a YouTuber is somebody who takes on the role of being an older brother or an older sister to your kid brothers and kid sisters. And you basically guide them through the world and you problematize the world and you discuss the world for hours and they follow you because you give them pictures and you give them sounds and you tell them about something. And I give you a perfect example of this. I live with Peter Towson, who's like a savant. And he keeps checking what's happening in China for our team every morning. And he doesn't look at the news. No, he just looks at these YouTubers from China, and they're usually Western guys who are married to Chinese girls and they live in Shanghai, and they tell him everything about what life in China is actually like. The way a really, really good documentary at best could do it maybe 30 years ago, but that no news report could ever cover. And of course, Peter knows more about China than any of us guys who are sitting there watching BBC or CNN at the same time. We know nothing compared to him. That is how you now learn. So you just find the people out there who are credible, who love you, like an older brother and older sister would, and who guide you with their expertise through the landscapes you know where to go. And this is deeply human. This is incredibly tribal. In the tribe, we always look for a mentor and we become their mentee and we become younger versions of them and they have the same archetype that we have, the same personality traits, the same talents, and they just show us how to do things so we can mimic creatively and learn. This is what people are doing now. So if this is the 2020s, and if the corona was something we need in between, I would declare I've seen the death of hypernarcissism. It no longer pays off. We throw it in the spam box. We hate it. But we love anybody who invites us to join a tribe. So anybody comes to with loving heart and says that, listen, I'm a member of a community and would love to invite you to be a member of a community. That's the future.
So yeah, I think I have a sense that we should like talk offline or maybe come to the podcast or something, because I'd love to chat with you more. But what came alive there was that, you know, my assessment of the culture war, it's like we can't win the culture war by playing with the same weapons that are being used right now. And then what's coming alive.
Well, maybe the culture war's already over. I mean, for God's sake, America is going to pick a president in November. How obvious can it be that the president doesn't matter when you've chosen to take 2 old corona corpses and choose between them? It's just like, I can't think of anything more boring than looking at these old men. I mean, we're all thinking, aren't we, that maybe they're both dead by November? You know, it's, yeah, but maybe something new that isn't the White House needs to take over. And hopefully it isn't Jeff Bezos' Amazon dictatorship. That's where we should look next.
Thank you.
I'd love to do it, Peter. Let's do that together. Yeah, let's explore that together. Tribalism, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that. Okay, so we have a question from Samir. Where do you see the phallic gaze pointing towards? I.e., what is the role of men in the transition ahead? And I would add to that as well, what is the role of women?
Okay, so the gazes are very important here. The magical gaze is foundational. The magical gaze is what meets you when you're born and hopefully what you see when you die. So the magical gaze is, it's not your mother. It's your midwife. It's usually the grandmother. It's an older woman who has been leading the mother into her motherhood. So she gives birth to you. So when you come out, and first thing is like, oh, I want to die, or I want to get back in, I don't want to live. And then somebody meets you with a big smile on their face. It's called the magical gaze. The magical gaze is the gaze of unconditional love. If you ever experienced that somebody just looked at you with a smile and just loved you beyond everything, that's the magical gaze. So it's not gender specific. A man can obviously give you a magical gaze. We call it the magical gaze because in the order of things, because we come out of the female body and we also return to the female body when we die. The female body is origin. The female body is where we come from and where we go to. And in this sense, the male body and what we call the phallus is only like a little boyish protest against how things actually operate. And that's all humanity could ever hope for. So what we do then with the phallic gaze, it is simply the other gaze that we need when we grow up. So phallus is just a name for leaving the matrix and then leaving the mamilla. So we leave first the body, and then we're unified with the female body again at the mamilla, and then we leave the breast and we have to move on. And then we look at another world. And it's like Freud said, it's wherever your mother is looking that isn't you. Hopefully she's looking at a man, or if she's a lesbian, she's looking at a girlfriend. It doesn't matter, but she's looking somewhere to something that you cannot be yet. And this creates the urge inside the child that it wants to leave the mamilla, it wants to be independent, it wants to try its own way, it wants to say, oh, no, I want to do things my way, okay, to one day become an adult. That means the phallic gaze looks at the world first and then looks back at you. And it gives you an honest answer of your potential. It gives you the straightforward answer you're looking for when you want to grow, because you can't have somebody smiling at you unconditionally no matter what. No, sometimes it just gets boring that all the children get the same gold star on every little painting they do. And maybe you want to be a little better than the other guys at doing a painting, and you go into rivalry and it turns out you got the talent to make a better painting. Then you want to be the only kid who gets the gold star. And to be the only kid who gets the gold star, to confirm that you have a specific talent, you need the phallic gaze. So in religion, the magical gaze is what we have down here on earth. Usually we look to an older woman and tell me, I've studied tribes in the Amazons and in Greenland and places. And the older woman is always the person they're all terrified of. She's the matriarch, right? You're all responsible to her, whether you're a man or a woman. But the phallic gaze we're looking for is usually an older man who comes back from being out there in the world and comes back in, and he greets us and he looks at what we're doing, and that's what we trust his judgment when we go forward. So we put the phallic gaze in the sky, and that's what we're talking about the satellites as the replacement of the phallic gaze.
Interesting. Okay, but so what risks are there in terms of like the phallic gaze from satellites, you know, being taken over by authoritarianism, or this idea of like the Peter Pan syndrome? Like, how can that be perverted, and what kind of cost will we incur, especially since we're also, it seems like, in this matriarchal gaze, like with how people talk online and you know, with social justice, like passive aggression, that seems to be like part of our discourse, and the megaphone is on our digital platforms seem to be stoking that. So what do you see within that kind of?
Yeah, it actually relates to what Peter discussed before about the culture wars. And if you want to go beyond the culture wars and try to take a more diplomatic stance in between them and understand them better, it is the misunderstanding of patriarchy and matriarchy and what they actually mean to us that is the problem today. And I always emphasize that I hate the fact that patriarchy became a bad word, because patriarchy is just a word for where young men are looking for older men for guidance. But what I do then, because I love to use the word patriarchy to provoke, yes, I always use the word matriarchy in the same sentences to emphasize that the matriarchy and the patriarchy matriarchy operate in parallel, and we're all included, because the matriarchy is what we call the inner circuit in any tribal construct I've looked at, and the patriarchy is the outer circuit. But of course, for the patriarchy matriarchy to be able to communicate in any flock animal, you have a certain number of people who become homosexuals and transsexuals and wonderful, beautiful, androgynous people. So we call them an androgynous caste. As anybody who's been to a hair salon or been to a couple therapist would know, it takes gay people to sort out the shit the heterosexual people run into all the time. So we need them, right? We need about 4 or 5% of them in the general population, and that's exactly the numbers we have. And then we have another 4% of the population that actually are go-betweens between tribes. They're called shamanic caste people. They're the weirdos and the strange guys in the world. We usually pull the scapegoats from out of there, and we would pull somebody through the streets and would hang them and kill them. It's probably a shamanic person that we use. Any dirty work that needs to be done that nobody wants to touch, like being, a brothel madam, or a sex worker, or an executioner. Any of those things are shamanic traits, shamanic personalities. We call them shamanoid personalities, even in the world of psychology. And I find them incredibly interesting to study, because they're also the only hope we have at a paradigm shift like the current one. Because if you're going to have some people who are going to walk in between tribes, or in our case, in between nations, or in between cultural spheres, you'll be able to talk to people, then we discover that when we put shamanoid people in a psychological laboratory, they don't understand things like skin color. They don't understand why other people are concerned about people looking different. Because they're just used to it. They're born into a world where their mind is just completely geared towards, I don't care what gender you have or skin color you have. I don't even care what age you have. I'm beyond and weirdly in between those things. And these are the people we would always find running around in the forest, taking the ultimate risks, dying young. All those things that we attribute to rock stars and the lesser gods are these shamanic traits. And we need them because the only people, if we only are going to have blockchains and artificial intelligence helping people to communicate across cultural lines, the only people who naturally walk across cultural lines and are not affected by them are shamanic caste people. So we need the androgynous and we need shamanic people more than ever. And I think by stating that clearly, we can go back to defining what does it mean to be a regular heterosexual man or regular heterosexual woman? And why are 95% of all people like that? And why isn't that beautiful and powerful? And then we can overcome the culture war. But I think it's impossible unless we see the bigger tribal human picture.
I really want to keep digging into this, but I'm going to continue to ask questions in the chat. Is the concept of herd immunity, will it kill the Western individual and wake them up to their individual reality? What do you think about that?
Oh, the herd immunity connected to individualism. Okay, that was a weird question, but fascinating. Herd immunity is, to me, a medical term. So if you study epidemiology, and I'm a philosopher, if you're a philosopher, then you're a complexity theorist. If you're a complexity theorist, there are three things you love: meteorology, seismology, and epidemiology. Why? Because they involve human beings and relations to the earth, and they're incredibly complex and full of data. So that's why you study epidemiology if you're a complexity theorist. And herd immunity means that on average, about 70 to 80% of the general population have to have had a certain, say, a virus in this case. So that when the virus comes back, possibly even in an even worse form, the immunity is so strong that it doesn't stick. So you get very few people, if any people, who get sick. So you don't get a second epidemic in that case. Some countries are obviously going towards that direction. Sweden is one of them, for example, where I live. We're basically now accepting that with 50% of the population here in Stockholm have already had the virus or been exposed to it. We suffer a higher death rate than other countries do. But the trick here is that we don't expect vaccines to be around until several years from now, if ever. And because we can't count on the vaccines to be around, it's better to prepare to avoid the next wave of the epidemic and allow it to pass through the population. And then the only thing we need to sort out is that, do we have enough ventilators for the people who get sick, so we save as many as we possibly can. But then we can avoid the second and the third wave when they come. Now, of course, some countries will try this strategy. Other countries like New Zealand have just said, no, we're just going to lock up the country and nobody's going to be able to enter. And then we're just going to wait it out and have no idea where we're going to go next. But at least we have fewer deaths. So that's what herd immunity does. I would say that I don't see it directly tying into the question of individualism, collectivism, and tribalism, because I think the individualism, collectivism divide will be solved by a dialectical route into tribalism, which also happens to be a return back into deep history, into what it means to be human. And in that case, I prefer to stay with the Dunbar number and say that people can accept another 157 grown-ups around them. It's called a clan. And once they accept the clan with a little storytelling and a few narratives, they can accept that we can go into a tribe and be 1,500 or 2,000 people that you do not kill or envy too much. The problem then is anything larger than that is always a challenge for humanity. And we all know that as soon as you live together with more than the tribe size, we start to become criminals and we start to have disloyalties towards one another. And that's something we've struggled with for the past 10,000 years, and we'll keep on struggling with it for a long time, hopefully now with the help of more shamans.
Excellent. Amy, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, sure. So my question is very quick. I wanted to see if you could discern the line between public safety and personal responsibility and what you thought about that.
Thank you for a good question. Yeah, this comes down to trust. So we all know that cultures that people have trusted each other for a long time, preferably where you don't have to lock the door when you leave the house. I mean, that would be the ultimate evidence that you trust your village neighbors, right? We all know that the longer the chains of trust are in a culture, the more people do take responsibility for one another. So it's easier and cheaper and more efficient to go towards a society at minimal cost. For example, you get a pandemic if you have long chains of trust. Now, I'm not saying you must have that. I don't want to be moralist about it. There are highly efficient cultures where the chains of trust are minimal. I would say that's probably the case in some of these city-states around the world where people have just moved in the last 3 generations and work really hard and pay low taxes, and you have to take care of yourself. And maybe you have a family or a congregation that you trust. The government is really usually weak and small. That's places like Dubai and Hong Kong. I wouldn't expect people in Dubai and Hong Kong to feel that they can trust their neighbors the way you can in Switzerland or Sweden. So I don't want to be moralistic about it. All I'm saying is that the longer and the stronger the chains of trust are in a given society, the more the opposition between public safety and personal responsibility becomes a non-issue. Because it's interesting that I hear you say this come from North America, but I don't hear any Scandinavian asking the same question. Because they would automatically assume that public safety and personal responsibility are interconnected. It's just a courtesy that you don't spit at your neighbor and you behave gracefully in society, and you hopefully avoid not getting too drunk and sleeping with the wrong person at the wrong time, because we have a pandemic at the moment. But it's a cost of benefit analysis you need to do. And of course, I'm also a strong cosmopolitanist, meaning I'm a strong proponent of cultures intermingling with each other and challenging people to take on strangers. I love the big empires of history. I love the trade routes. And I love the whorehouses and the bathhouses and everything dirty that went with it, right? But I also know that the price we pay when we create larger communities quickly is that the natural change of trust that existed then evaporate. And then you need more technology, you need more machines, we need more help from intelligent machines to actually be able to trust one another. We need more blockchains the less we actually trust our neighbors naturally. So it's a trade-off thing.
Great. And then we have a question here from Owen. Owen, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question to Bard?
Hey, Alexander, how's it going, mate? So I was thinking about this fight against totalitarianism and how, I guess in the 20th century, liberty, freedom has been perhaps the ideal and the value that we hold up against it. I'm wondering if as we move into a more censorocratic power structure, is there a new ideal that kind of takes the place of freedom and liberty that we can cling to? Or does freedom and liberty still remain what we go for?
Thank you for a great question. The way I see it is that I try to avoid becoming moralistic. So I don't go into the sort of freedom versus totalitarianism debate in itself. Rather, I want to have arguments where it pays off to do the right thing for the right reasons anyway. And it's better than to look at the effects, long-term effects. And here's the problem. You know, when the coronavirus started spreading in Hubei in China, And the Chinese authorities tried to keep quiet about it for about 3 to 4 months, and they basically punished anybody who told the truth. The funny thing was that I had all these kids everywhere who just referred back to the Chernobyl series. You know, that we all watched Chernobyl the year before. It's an old friend of mine, Johan Renck, who did that. And Johan's ambition when he wrote Chernobyl was obviously not to write about the Soviet Union, but to write about communist China, or basically to write about the problem with any totalitarian system. Because any totalitarian system would have a little boy pharaoh at the top called the dictator. He's an 11-year-old Peter Pan. And he doesn't want to hear anything that he doesn't like. And even if he understands, listening to some mentor, that he should hear things he doesn't like, nobody dares to tell him things they don't want to tell him. That means there's always a delay in any system like that before the truth reaches power. And until truth reaches power, it cannot be executed on. So Xi Jinping must have been shocked to find out that everybody kept quiet for about 4 months about a pandemic that could kill his power. It could kill him. So he probably then went into reverse and started looking like the tough guy who's going to go lock up everybody and lock them all in. And of course, China's gone in that direction, meaning now they have a massive problem is that now when the virus comes back into China, 95% of China were covered by Xi Jinping. He was locked in Hubei. But what are they going to do now when 1.2, 1.3 billion Chinese people are exposed to the virus anyway? And he has no solution to that. He must shit his pants every day with that problem. But this is also a great argument against totalitarianism. I would say the best argument ever is that Stalin died alone. And if you go into the biography of Stalin, Joseph Stalin, he was the king of the world, probably the most powerful person on the planet when he died. But he was so lonely when he died that he was sick, that none of his doctors dared to go into the room, being afraid they would be executed by him if he didn't like what they told him. So they decided not to go into the room. So this guy died the loneliest death ever. Stalin died the loneliest death ever. He died alone, plagued by his disease, not being cured or treated, basically because the doctors decided, let's just pretend he's in there and we're not in there, and then we all save our asses so we can get out of here. And that's exactly when you kill the dictator. When the priests decide to kill the dictator, that's exactly what happens. That's a killing of Tutankhamun in Egypt and all the way up to Stalin's death. And I think that's a good story to tell us that this system is deeply dysfunctional. And I loved it because Johan Renck cleverly put Chernobyl out there, and the kids could understand that what's going on in communist China today was Chernobyl. And then they learned from Chernobyl that actually when a disaster strikes, then a dictatorship is incredibly vulnerable because it's the worst place for a disaster to strike. The other way of looking at that is then to look at creativity. So we can look at ecotopianism, which is saving the planet. We can look at cosmopolitanism, which is getting along with our neighbors. Any dictator in the world could embrace that. That's why Singapore and Dubai are dictatorships for practical purposes. But when it comes to actual creativity, and if the economy is going to be run on creative destruction and then creative construction following that, we'll know that China is really good at mimicking things, but any innovation that takes place in China is happening in Taiwan and Hong Kong. It's not happening in mainland China. So the really great argument here is that if you're going to have a system where we go into what the old Iranians called the frascio kerete, a state of ever renewed creativity. Okay, so imagine that as the future, an utopian future of frascio kerete. If that is ever going to happen, it cannot be in a dictatorship. It must be in some kind of pluralistic sensocracy for that to happen.
Excellent.
All right.
That's excellent. Great. Okay, well, we have about 5 minutes here to wrap up. There's still this great question in the chat. Okay, I think maybe we'll try and cover this one because it's about the trickster archetype. So Kevin, do you want to ask your question and then maybe?
Sure. Thanks, Alexander. It's been great. So you mentioned a few times the role of like the shamanic sort of trickster archetype wandering across cultural lines. How do you think that'll change or has changed in a digital age when every tribe is already connected and these lines are really blurred? And so how do you see that role changing, or do you have any people who you think embody this archetype well in the digital sphere?
Great question. I'm obsessed with shamanoid personalities, but I should emphasize that there's a series of different archetypes among the shamanoid personalities. Trickster is just one of them. And what's characteristic for the trickster is that he or she just speak their mind and do not care about the consequences. So the trickster is always a person who we must have in a society, but who we can allow the right to not care about the consequences of their behavior. That is different, for example, from, say, the priest, who's another shamanoid personality, another shamanic character. The priest is responsible for the outcome of what he does. Actually, he is the ultimate strategist. And if you put him inside a court, he's probably the ultimate intrigue maker. But the priest is very different from the trickster precisely in this domain. And I'd love to develop it further. Maybe we can do it when we're off this little show here tonight. But I'd love to develop it further. We're working a lot with these characters. And I'd like also sociologists and anthropologists to be able to pick up on these ideas on the shamanic cast and describe and identify different shamanoid personalities. And of course, personally, I'm involved in the sex workers union in Europe. And, you know, it's a deep personal thing for me, you know, and also to redefine drug addiction, because it's not really addiction. It's very natural for people to take drugs sometimes, especially if they're shamanoid personalities. So maybe we could even allow the shamanoid personalities to have their own laws and do their own things, because there are a lot of things that most of us cannot handle and couldn't do. But we could even give a license for some people to say, you're a damn trickster, or you're allowed to take as many drugs as you like and experiment widely, because you are that personality type who we should afford as a society, and for the sake of tolerance and creativity, to go ahead and make these experiments.
Yeah, we should totally have that conversation. That would be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about in this area, especially with like sex work and how that's changing in the digital era. There's so much to talk about. Okay, so you really put a lot of really great ideas in our heads, and there's even more great things coming up at the STOA. So we're going to talk about some of the events that are coming up. Bard, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Raven. And we all know that everybody's watching because of Queen Raven, and I just went along with the ride. Because you're so beautiful, interiorly, exteriorly, in every way possible. You're an amazing kid sister, amazing kid sister.
Great. I loved having you here too. It was amazing. And I've been following your work, and it's so exciting to actually have a conversation. And with that, would you like to talk about Akira the Dawn, Peter?
Yes. So our next event coming up, actually the next event is your event, Raven, which I'll let you talk about. But the next event after that is 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. Akira the Dawn is going to do some live streaming on Stoic Meaning Wave. So he has like basically, read Marcus Aurelius's meditation to like, you know, his music. And so that's really dope. And he's going to have a live session here. So you're all invited. Go to the website, www.stoa.ca, and RSVP there.
Sweet. And then the other event that's happening today with me, yours truly, is Socratic speed dating. So today we're gonna experiment with a question game called Ask Hole, which is a very like controversial, provoking game. And yeah, everyone's welcome to come. So it's gonna basically be, you get mixed up into breakout rooms for about 8 minutes with a stranger, and you have a provocative question that you both answer together. So that's gonna be at 7 p.m. And then we also have some other events coming up. Amy, would you like to plug your upcoming event?
Sure. I don't know if I can plug it, but basically on the heels of talking about archetypes, we will be kind of exploring masculine, feminine archetypes and seeing if they actually can be reformed and recast in more contemporary terms.
Awesome, a really important conversation for us all to be having. And then is Tyson, do you want to talk about your event as well?
Thank you. Yes, Freestyling Through a Pandemic is the name of the event, and we will be exploring our musicality and rhythm and poetry through freestyle rap. And in my experience, it has been one of the most powerful ways for me to connect with people and get to know people and experience group flow is through music. And it's an especially interesting experiment done through Zoom, I'm finding. And last time was really fun, so we're going to build on that energy and momentum. And I look forward to flowing with you all there. That's tomorrow at 8 Eastern.
Yeah, I'm feeling nervous about coming already. Yeah, but I'm excited. All right, and with that, we see the Stoa as a gift for everyone to be using at this time. And if you feel inspired to give a gift to the Stoa, you can visit us at thestoa.ca under the gift economy. And with that, we've come to a close. Thank you everyone for being here.